Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, and diplomats in the quest for peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. This is our first episode in our special mini-series in which we focus on peace negotiations in Ukraine. In recent weeks, there has been a lot of movement regarding peace negotiations to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Some positive movement, some negative movement. With our guests in this mini-series, we will explore some of the key issues and challenges that will arise during negotiations and possible options for tackling these head-on. You'll hear from Ukrainian and international experts on issues ranging from territorial integrity and post-conflict elections to negotiating security guarantees, justice, and reparations. Today, I am honored to welcome back Professor David Crane, the founding chief prosecutor of the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone and a PILPG Senior Peace Fellow. David, welcome back.
Good to be back, Paul.
Well, as our listeners know, David served as chief prosecutor from 2002 to 2005. He is responsible for the indictment of the president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, the first sitting head of state in history to be held accountable for atrocity crimes. David has also served on active duty in the United States Army for 20 years, including as a paratrooper, a special operations officer, and as a judge advocate. And as many of our listeners know, David is the author of Every Living Thing, Facing Down Terrorists, Warlords, and Thugs in West Africa, A Story of Justice. David is also the co-chair of the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues, which every year brings together current and former prosecutors, judges, and defense counsel to share lessons learned and discuss challenges faced by the ongoing effort to establish effective mechanisms to hold responsible those who have committed atrocity crimes. Now, in this episode, we will discuss David's recent blog post with PILPG, in which he explores a ceasefire model based upon the successful multinational force and observers established for the Sinai Peninsula. David is especially well positioned to have this conversation, given that he was the legal advisor to the multinational force in the Sinai. We'll examine how such a framework could be adapted for the Donbas region of Ukraine and how the model could serve as a framework for the neutral international force to help ensure compliance with any ceasefire that may occur and to facilitate further dialogue. Now, let me note here right off the bat that this model is not intended to replace security guarantees for Ukraine as a whole, but to contribute to a broader conversation on peacekeeping strategies for Ukraine. Now, given the rapidly evolving events, we'll also discuss David's thoughts on the global shifting order, the role of the United Nations, and the rise of power-centric diplomacy in relation to negotiations to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Wow. So with all of that in mind, let's jump in, David.
All right.
So a multinational force, regardless of the Kremlin's continued opposition to foreign peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, it's crucial now to begin considering innovative peacekeeping models that could help stabilize Ukraine's occupied territories. So let's discuss your recent blog post with PILPG outlining a potential ceasefire model for the Donbas. Can you walk us through the key elements of this model and what makes it a particularly viable option?
Well, it's great to be here, and these issues are so very, very important. And as we try to figure out how we stabilize the Donbass region to a point where then the parties can build a sense of trust in potentially going to a peacekeeping table to discuss the end of a tragic conflict that was, and I want to make it clear, it was started by the Russian Federation, contrary to other commentary. So that the beauty of a multinational force and observers, and let me break that down rather quickly. It's a multinational force is a armed force that is available to assist in keeping the parties apart during a ceasefire to ensure that one or the other isn't trying to maneuver and to try to gain an advantage. A multinational force would be armed not with offensive military weapons, but weapons to defend themselves and to keep the peace within their zone. Observers are neutral members of various countries who are selected to have the ability to travel through all of the zones, and I'll explain that in a minute, to just drop in and making sure that both parties and the stable and the multinational force are complying with the agreement, so that over time that builds a trust so that people aren't shooting at each other, but just maintaining where they are. So along the model of the multinational force in the Sinai, I created a model called the multinational force and observers for the Donbass region. And as was in the Sinai, and it worked, this is one of the most successful peacekeeping operations in history. I was there in 1983. The first iteration began in 1981 after the Camp David peace accords. And the multinational force and observers in the Sinai are still there. And it has done an excellent job of making sure that Egypt and Israel feel confident and comfortable with each other as to their common borders. And that it has played out to be that. In fact, the mission has now evolved into a lot of mainly clearing mines. That when I was there were over 37 million mines in the Sinai. And so that's going to take a long time to get those mines out of that part of the world. But anyway, the multinational force and observers in the Sinai had three zones. Zone A was Israel, 10 miles wide. Zone B was where the multinational force and observers were located, and that was most of the Sinai. And then Zone C was a 10-mile strip along the western side of the Sinai that was occupied by Egypt. And so this is a workable model, a model that can, in fact, be used in creating a stabilization and a trust building operation that would lead to potentially to peace. And so in the Donbass region, you would have a zone A, which would be occupied by Russian Federation forces and police constabulary. Zone B would be where the MFO Donbass region would be occupied by various volunteer nations. And in the Sinai, we had 13 nations that volunteered a battalion-sized forces and other kind of military logistics capability, so that would be a similar arrangement in the Donbass region. And then Zone C would be occupied by Ukraine armed forces and constabulary. And everybody in all of the zones would be precluded from placing offensive military capabilities, so that in Zone A, B, and C, everyone would have the defensive weapons, small arms and those kind of things, but there would be no offensive weapon systems within Zone A, B, or C. And so that's the general concept and idea of an MFO Donbass region, similar to the one in the Sinai, to build that stability and trust so that parties can begin to think about dealing with peace. But, and importantly, the MFO Donbass region would be headed by a director general, a civilian director general, and then the multinational force would be led by a neutral general officer who would have overall command of those forces. The interesting thing and the most important thing also is that on a regular basis agreed to by the parties, all the parties would meet to discuss issues and challenges and things that happen along the borders to deconflict so that they can be rectified. And again, it will be a crawl, walk, run scenario. In other words, as the force moves in and takes control, and as armed forces leave zones A and C, it will be a slow expansion of the multinational force into the Donbass region. And then they would continue to occupy those regions until it made political sense to, again, withdraw the MFO Donbass region. But we're looking at a years long positioning so that at some point the parties feel comfortable enough to sit down and develop a true peace. I think it's also important, and I know this is a little bit of a long introduction, but the Sinai, the multinational force in the Sinai was a result of a peace process, and it was a guarantor and a stabilizing force after the peace was signed. This is going to have to be different. This is going to be a stabilization and trust building exercise prior to some kind of peace accord. So it is different, but all things in the international world are different. There's no such a thing as a cookie cutter approach. So that we have to, I think our listeners have to understand that this should be a pre-peace accord arrangement versus one that's after, like in the Camp David Accords. But it can work.
Well, David, thanks for outlining in great detail how this multinational force might work in zones A, B, and C. Because as you and I've discussed in the past, and I've discussed with my other colleagues, there isn't a lot of creative thinking going on at the moment about how to ceasefire, or now we're even talking about a 1 month partial cessation of hostilities that the Europeans put on the table yesterday. But how does one actually secure a ceasefire so you have the space to negotiate? So I'm glad you laid that out. Let's ask a question about the two elephants in the room. What role do you envision that European forces, military forces, might play in this type of observer and multinational force mission, and or what role might the Americans play?
Well, again, in the multinational force and observers in the Sinai, we had 13 nations. Of course, the U.S. was one of those guarantor nations, but most of them were neutral and outside the fight, so to speak. So that the role of Europe would be a guarantor by agreeing to allow a MFO in the Donbass region to exist. NATO would be the backbone of this. In other words, if things went to hell in a handbasket, they're still NATO. And so NATO would have a supporting role only in the sense that it would be behind this MFO Donbass region. The members states of the Donbass region would be neutral nations, which, as it was in the Sinai, that don't have the dog in the fight. And so that we have, the nations that I'm contemplating that to be a part of that would be nations like China, Japan, India, Australia, Kenya, Argentina, Brazil, nations that have stature, have capacity to support this, but would not actually be a threat to either of the parties, Russia or Ukraine. In other words, both of the parties have to feel that there's nobody in the MFO that has another agenda. In other words, they have to feel that they are neutrally capable of stabilizing the area. Because again, we have to understand that Russia and Ukraine do not trust each other at all. So we have to have those types of nations that both sides feel they're getting an equal fair shake in stabilizing the region, because then it just gives so much opportunity then for diplomacy to kick in. There's so many off-ramps. Once you stabilize the Donbass region, there's so many off-ramps for both sides politically to wind this thing down and go to the peace table. But I think it's critical. Neutral nations, Global South and others will have to step forward. And it's really important. This is not a United Nations effort, as was the MFO in the Sinai. It was not a United Nations organization or supported by the United Nations other than politically being supported by. And I would certainly think that a General Assembly resolution saying that an MFO Donbass region would be something that would be important in stabilizing the region, but that would be the only type of involvement of the UN. Now, of course, regional organizations would also, like the European Union, Council of Europe, and all of that, again, would politically make a statement saying we support an MFO in the Donbass region, but again, they are not actually directly involved in it. That would have to be, again, in order to keep the comfort level of the two parties, Russia and Ukraine, to a level where they would allow these organizations to move into the Donbass region. Another, I think, important distinction is that in the MFO Sinai, both parties wanted peace, and both parties wanted the multinational force and observers to be there. It's going to be slightly different in the Donbass region because we're not at peace. Both parties really, this point in time, don't want peace, or at least certainly are verbally saying that. And so that's going to be a particular challenge as far as coming to some kind of force structure that is agreeable to both sides.
So, David, picking up on that point, how might the Europeans, the Americans, both vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, get the two parties to have buy-in for this type of arrangement?
Both parties have to realize that there's not going to be a victory either side. And so that both of the parties are going to have to decide politically, how do I end this in a way that is politically acceptable to my citizens and to my country? And I would think that that would be a huge leverage because, again, I think both sides have realized there is not going to be a total victory outcome on this. And I think that that's a realistic assertion. Now, the wrinkle in all of this, and again, just a month ago, this would have been a different answer, that there is a real wrinkle, and that is the Trump administration's go it alone strategy in foreign affairs. We're just going to do things because it's to our advantage, and the result be damned. And so the real problem with this is the United States and getting Trump to realize that this is probably the best way to end this thing, as opposed to making unrealistic demands on one party. And so Ukraine is going to need the United States because that's just the way life is at this point. But they're going to have to develop an ability to move the United States in a way that is amenable to both of them in order to create this. But really, the Achilles heel in this kind of idea of an MFO, multinational force and observers, is that the United States, if they don't buy into this, then that's going to be a challenge. But I think it's also important that the world is going to have to develop an ability to go it alone without the United States being a supportive player, something that has not happened in large measure in 80 years. But we're going to have to be creative and just come to the realization that the United States is not going to be a force multiplier, a nation that is going to be capable or wanting to be capable of ensuring international peace and security. So the rest of the world is going to have to develop methodologies by which then we can maintain some kind of stability, and so that the world doesn't wobble away and impact on the finance and global economy that surely follows after that.
Well, David, I'm going to want to come back to that, to your observations on this shifting and evolving, disintegrating
Sure.
global world order. Two more practical questions. First, though, on the MFO, one of the reasons is to be able to build confidence, to build trust. As you noted, there's zero confidence, zero trust between Russia and Ukraine, and for very good reasons on the part of Ukraine. How might, once you've deployed an MFO and it's doing its job, what other types of confidence building measures, and what is the pace and the tempo of those confidence building measures? How do you weave them into the process? What do you have in mind, or what did you see in the Sinai?
Well, what you have in the agreement, and it's just an agreement, it's not some type of international treaty, it's just an agreement between Ukraine and Russia and a representative of supporting nations to agree to allow an MFO into the Donbass region. But they would build into this agreement confidence building and safety valves by which, as tensions rise, there's an ability to come together at a table. And I was at the table between Israel and Egypt many times, and just allowing them to yell at each other and say, this isn't working and we need to worry about this, worried about that. So there are regular meetings, and then there are meetings that can be called by one side or the other to meet and just to talk about a problem, not shoot at each other if there's a problem. And so that in of itself is important. But one of the key aspects of all of this is the observers. These are neutral individuals who have the authority to move in zones A, B, and C, and to just check on and to observe what is going on in each of those zones and report to all the parties what's going on. And that is also an ability to, on all sides, to know that one side isn't taking advantage of the other and that one is complying and the other one is not, because of regular deconfliction efforts, as well as the observers being allowed without notice just to fly in to a particular police base in zone A or C, and then also move around zone B to make sure that the multinational force is also ensuring that they're complying. And, the multinational force, like we did in the Sinai, we had checkpoints, we had observers. And so that really what they're doing is occupying the whole region and being seen in the whole region with checkpoints, checking on things, making sure that you don't have individuals trying to move into another zone to create an advantage or to potentially attack. It's a pretty robust effort on the part of the force, but really one of the counterbalance to any kind of fears of somebody sneaking up on somebody is not just a robust force, but also the observers moving about on a daily basis, just dropping in by a helicopter, by vehicle, driving around, observing, watching, ensuring that both sides are complying with the agreement. It worked very well in the Sinai. It really did. And as time goes on, people realize that once they get the idea that this actually works, and it can, then it builds that it becomes more stable. The trust starts to move. And also, political events over time develop, which create possibilities to ensure a more just and secure peace.
Well, David, let me pick up on that point in terms of a just and secure peace, because MFO would, pause the conflict, would create a space for negotiations, for a ceasefire, for long-term security guarantees. But how might it be structured in a way so that it does not lead to the de facto or de jure partition of Ukraine?
That is, yeah, again, I think it's really important, and a peace process can begin at the same time that the multinational force is moving in to stabilize the region. It doesn't have to be, years down the road. It's just that, the process can be concurrent with each other. The MFO is only there to occupy and to stabilize. But once a peace process begins and then agreements are had, it is contemplated that the MFO then would withdraw and, according to whatever peace plan was signed, whatever accord is put into place. And that's something that remains to be speculated on. But so they stay in place until all parties are ready to allow the peace process to begin in whatever shape or form that is, to include possibly some type of occupation or movement or trading of territories or shifting of borders or not. That's part of the peace process. But the MFO Donbass region is that anchor, that cornerstone, that gyroscope that just allows the dust to settle, the firing to stop, and then a concurrent peace process is ongoing. And it allows an actual reality to the peace process. These various attempts talking about peace, but keeping certain parties out and all of those things, that isn't going to work. But it doesn't matter if we have an MFO Donbass region in place. The craziness of the peace process, and it can be crazy, having been involved in things like you for many, many years. All parties are assured that artillery isn't going to start, the missiles start all over. It takes the military problem out of the peace process. And I think that's a huge step in the right direction, because both parties aren't looking over their shoulders, listening to cruise missiles coming or drones coming over the border. Those stop. And so things it hopefully notches down the level of where both parties have guns. It's one of those things where you see in a Western where everybody has a gun pointing at each other and, who's going to put their gun down. Well, it doesn't matter, because the agreement of an MFO Donbass region is that parties all agree to put the guns down and then they'll talk. And that takes guns off the table, so to speak. in a way that both parties realize no one's going to sneak up on the other and start the whole thing over, because the MFO is going to be there to notice that, sound the alarm, and try to bring the parties together to eliminate that problem. But then you also have, as I mentioned earlier, you do have NATO in the background. It's not like it's going to be a massacre of all the MFO in the Donbass region by the Russian Federation or the Ukraine being caught in the middle. NATO will be there in a way that would allow, military stability if it went south. But again, that's where NATO would come in and Europe would come in because that's in their backyard.
And it would provide that security guarantee for the MFO, which was standing in the middle of the guys with guns.
Sure. But again, it was just our experience that, as you know, and I was there at the very early part where both parties were still kind of looking at each other, making sure that, everybody was kind of giving each other the side eye as far as, is this going to work? But over time, it is amazing that, and look what's happened now. Really, Israel, Egypt have normal relations, and the idea of guns and retaking the Sinai or invading in some form of some kind of surprise attack, that's been off the table for decades now, because of the fact that the MFO has been able to be there and be that cornerstone for peace and security in that region.
Well, David, let me pick up on a comment you made earlier about the shifting slash eroding world order and a movement towards this world order being shaped by strategic power blocks rather than collective governance, the rule of law, and is moving quite rapidly. Now, if this is the case, how does Ukraine operate in this new environment or this evolving environment to ensure its sovereignty and territorial integrity rather than simply being subjected to political deals, grand political bargains by the Americans and the Russians, or even by the Europeans and the Russians?
This is pure speculation on my part, considered speculation, but certainly speculation. And whatever I say today could be thrown out the window this time next week. So, we're in a state of flux at so many levels that we have not seen something like this since the end of World War II, and the world groped around trying to figure out how do we, in fact, put some four corners to this. I don't see where this is going to be going in a way that we will see a international peace structure that we have been used to since 1945 and the 80th anniversary of the UN. The UN will be an entity. The UN can be and hopefully be a player. But as the world beginnings to shift away from going to the United Nations to settle disputes peacefully, nations, states are thinking about a more nationalistic, more insular approach to their place in the world. And that is no more obvious than in places like China, Russia, and the United States. And reluctantly, the European Union is becoming that fourth power center, the counterweight to movement away from world body that looks to settle disputes and more of a go it alone approach as to how they deal with the rest of the world. This has actually happened in the past 2 weeks. And of course, and it's starting to manifest itself in many, many ways, with even the United States and Russia voting against the UN General Assembly resolution related to the third anniversary of the invasion. And now the U.S. is literally mouthing the very same words that Russia is related to who was the real invader, who really started it, and all of those are really troubling commentary, but is signaling to the world that they can't count on the United States to legitimately resolve the conflict in Ukraine. The U.S. has lost its legitimacy, even though it has power to force things to happen in a positive or negative way, but they've lost their legitimacy. And I think this is where a critical point. The U.S. had a legitimacy not too long ago, but they can no longer come to the table by their own assertions in support of Russia to be an honest broker in this anymore. The honest broker in any kind of potential stabilization and peace is Europe. They still have that capacity, that honest broker status. But the U.S. no longer has the capacity to bring everybody to the table. Now, this is a terrible situation for Ukraine. I remember writing back in September of 2022 an op-ed that said that time and distraction are Putin's ultimate weapon. He was just going to wait out the military situation in the hope that there is some kind of political distraction that gives him opportunity. Well, guess what? It's true. A political opportunity has happened that gives him a lot more standing and an ability to be more successful in this adventure that he has started in 2014 and again in 2022, where he is obviously not capable of coming to an end state that's favorable to him. But now all of a sudden, he has a political capacity that he never contemplated in this extreme way, that he is now partnering with the United States in forcing Ukraine to stop defending itself rightfully, and in some ways sending a signal that they're going to support whatever initiatives Russia does. That's a terrible situation. And as when I don't have an answer to how Ukraine works through this absent a assertive, positive approach by the European Union and Europe in general in saying, we'll do this, we'll take it, we will move forward and support you, and hopefully develop diplomatic and military methodologies by which we can stabilize the situation and then hopefully deal with some kind of peace with Russia / the United States. It's interesting. Europe would be on one side of the table, Ukraine would be somewhere, and then the United States and Russia would be on the other side of the table. It's flipped that much. And this is just the opening scenario of future types of military and political situations that we're going to see the U.S. Again on the wrong side of the fence. And then, of course, how they deal with China is going to be a major problem. But again, all of the dictators of the world are watching like crocodiles, saying, well, my goodness, is the U.S. really going to step up? And, China's thinking, if we go after Taiwan, where is this going to go? If North Korea says, if we move south into South Korea, what's going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. We can go all around the world and discuss these scenarios. So these are the future scenarios. And so what we're seeing playing out right now is this scenario that everybody's watching and trying to figure out what place the United States now has, not as a stabilizer, but a destabilizing nation that causes problems, not just in the Donbass region, but also around the world. Nations are still trying to figure out their place in this and what side do they want to be on, not just in Europe, the global South. Everyone is trying to figure out, how do we position ourselves with a destabilizing United States as opposed to one that was a stabilizer in large measure. Granted, they're not a perfect country, but at least some sense of stabilization that is now quickly leaving the international stage. So it just, in some ways, I'm just telling our listeners, watch and wait, because again, things are literally changing on a weekly basis, fundamentally, not just challenges and issues and that always go with international relations, but fundamental changes to the world order as we have known it.
Well, David, your informed speculation is pretty scary.
It's not going to be a bright future at this point. Now, again, world shifts, things move. It is anticipated that Donald Trump will serve his term, and then whatever politically happens after 2028, we don't know. But we're in this for another 4 years, and the world has to just come to the reality to think in a way outside the box as to how do we mold and shape a world that is at least stable enough so that we can continue international commerce and finance in a way that people can live their lives in a hope that there is no kind of major conflict. I'm a child of the Cold War all my life. I've been, fighting the Soviet Union and the Russians in some form or another. But at least we had the assurance under the United Nations that there's a good chance there probably wasn't going to be World War III. Those checks and balances really at this point are no longer there. And so we are closer to the danger of a World War III than personally I've ever seen it in my professional lifetime.
Well, David, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to scare us, to share with us your thoughts and insights, both on the very practical dimensions of an MFO for the Donbass based on the success of the Sinai model, and also your thoughts on this shifting global world order and what it means for the Ukrainians, as well as the Europeans, the Americans, and our colleagues and friends in the global South. Um, I could always count on you for serious thinking and innovative ideas, and you have not disappointed. So I'm very grateful that you were willing to share what's going on in your mind right now and what you're thinking, both about ceasefire, stability, and about this new environment in which we're negotiating or attempting to negotiate peace. So thank you, David.
It's been my pleasure. And Europe, it's your time in history. You have to meet the moment.